Welcome to the Cultural IP Audiovisual Series. Today we have a special guest joining us, Nyasha Foy, a leader in legal affairs, business, and intellectual property law. Nyasha brings a wealth of experience in media, entertainment, and emerging technologies, and has worked with global brands like Sotheby's, Buzzfeed, Vice, and Complex. She's deeply committed to service, holding key roles on the Save the Music Foundation board, the Black Entertainment and Sports Lawyers Association, and she served as a trustee of the Wesleyan University Board of Trustees. In her self-titled post, Nyasha, on her blog, betweenthehyphens.com, Nyasha, you describe yourself as Nyasha the lawyer, the photographer, the soprano two, the Aries, the middle sister, the Delta, the Wesleyan grad, the trustee, the overachiever, the procrastinator, the mentor, and the mentee. I know we're talking about intellectual property today, but I'm personally excited to witness glimpses of all of those attributes and titles during this conversation. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass it over to you to further introduce yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for that such a gracious introduction. You definitely have done your homework. And I'm very excited to join you today for this conversation. My name is Nyasha Foy. I'm a multi-hyphenate business and legal affairs executive, corporate transactional lawyer, creative, and thought leader. So many different titles that I wear. On the professional side, I have extensive experience advising global brands, startups, scale-ups in the areas of intellectual property, media, entertainment, and emerging technologies, and some of which I'm sure we'll jump into today. And you kind of, you rattled off a lot of my resume. And, in addition to being a business affairs executive, I'm a really active board member on the Save the Music Board Foundation, currently as the vice chair of the board, as well as a board member for the Black Entertainment Sports Lawyers Association. I have a music and French degree from Wesleyan University, which I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. It's definitely some of the origins of my passion for intellectual property are definitely deeply rooted in my own creative practice. I'm a graduate of New York Law School, and I'm admitted to practice in New York and California. I am also a very proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And again, super excited to join you here today and to nerd out a little bit on probably what is one of my most favorite subjects.
So you've worked at innovative digital media companies like Complex and Vice, and you've worked at one of the most, if not the most, renowned auction house in the world, Sotheby's. And for these organizations, intellectual property assets, notably copyrights, are the value drivers of those businesses. And as you mentioned, you're also a writer and a musician yourself, and of course, an attorney. So IP is clearly a part of who you are. But for a listener who may not know what intellectual property is, how do you personally define, or how would you personally define intellectual property for them?
I love that question because I think people hear the term intellectual property and think that they have a sense of what it is, and most people do. And then when you give them examples, they're like, wait a minute, that's not what I thought. For me, I define it as when we think about property, right? We think about real property. It's a tangible, physical thing that we can see, we can touch. It's your phone. It's a piece of land. It's something that we can literally experience in a very tangible way. Intellectual property, though, its cousin, are often things that originate as ideas in our mind, right? So things that we can't see, that we can't touch, that we can't feel until we get these amazing ideas out of our mind, these amazing creative ideas, and there's a big umbrella that those things can sit under, whether or not those are machines for which patent law covers, whether or not those are certain design elements which fall into the realm of trademark, but more for the purposes of the things that I work on day to day, more in the copyright area. So we're talking about words, not individual words, we know that can't be protected, but we're talking about books and song lyrics and Instagram posts and all of these things that start with an idea in our mind. And once we fix them in a tangible medium, which is, language coming directly from copyright law, we now have the birth and the genesis of intellectual property. And so for me, there's always been this tie to the creative communities that draws me into intellectual property. You didn't ask me this question, but a lot of folks, how did you get into law school? Like, what made you think about going to law school? And for me, it was the creative industries, right? It was knowing that, TLC went bankrupt when I was a kid. And why? They made all of this intellectual property. They made all of this music. How did these things happen? And that sort of being my entryway and my rabbit hole into understanding, as you kind of indicated in the intro, what are the economic systems? What are the legal systems? What are the frameworks that allow these ideas that we come up with to be able to manifest themselves into the world? And how do we ensure that those who are involved in that process, in particular, the authors and the creators, are being protected with respect to their ideas and their manifestations and their creations?
There's so many things about that definition that resonate with me, but I think that the piece that's so powerful is that um, the mint of intellectual property, the mint of this currency, the mint of this asset comes from the human mind, and that source being the most valuable source of what's driving our economy, the most valuable source of what's sort of the underbelly of particular industries. You mentioned the music industry. We're going to get into that a little bit later when we talk about new technologies. But I just think it's so powerful. Like you said, people might think about intellectual property, but might not understand that it's something that they could potentially and probably do create every single day.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating to me as I've, through law school and I continue to keep, reading and nerding out on various aspects and intricacies of IP is one, how we get to the current regimes that we have. When you trace back the history of intellectual property, it first started, I was literally reading an article from from Barbara Ringer, rather, who was one of the former registrars of the Copyright Office. And in this article called The Demonology of Copyright, she kind of discusses the history of it. It started with, before we were a more literate society, in order to be able to have the right to print a book, you had to seek permission from the state, who then gave permission to a printer to be able to print your words. And that was a way of being able to closely guard what we allowed society to be able to learn about when we were only able to learn through books. And we get to copyright law by saying, actually, it is the right of an author to be able to distribute their works. We shouldn't need to go through these intermediary systems. And as we've continued to watch copyright evolve, so even now we're operating in the United States under copyright law that was substantially created in 1976, right? That went effective in 1976. So we are many, many years from what they could even conceive of when they were working on this particular law, right?
Right.
Continue to sort of keep seeing, as you kind of mentioned, we'll get to newer industries who are now needing to fall underneath this umbrella. And we are challenged with questions of how do we protect these new ideas and these different manifestations, and what should we protect, and the why we should protect. And I think for me, the why is not only really, really important, but like an incredible piece of legislation that a lot of people probably don't dig into. So I will quote from you, because I should have this memorized, but I don't, from the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. The Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts. That is the purpose of copyright, in order to incentivize individuals to continue to keep progressing science, making more art, because more art for the world is a better benefit for the public. And we do so by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. What an amazing concept that we come up with in the Constitution. And not to take it there, but we had rights as creators, some of us, before we had rights as full people in this country. And I find that to even be such an amazing sort of concept to just really think about, that I had rights to be able to protect what it is that I put on paper before I had the right to be able to vote, before I had the right to be able to call myself a full citizen of the United States, because that aspect of being able to encourage people to create is at the genesis of our country.
You know, the IP clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, being just a few sentences in the Constitution that allows Congress to be able to create and enable the copyright laws, the Patent Act, is a brilliant, I think, under-discussed and I think undervalued piece of legislation. Just it's those words now allow us to make sure that we're able to have this conversation digitally. Those words allow industries to be able to build revenue for their employees and for their execs. It allows creatives to be able to monetize what they create. And I love the fact that you mentioned how our ideas, what comes from our mind, in a lot of ways we had rights for that before we had rights to move physically, the trap our bodies but can't, our lock our bodies but can't trap our mind notion. I think that that's incredible. Let's move forward just to your personal story. I'm curious, you did mention, your background educationally, but if we can go back before law school, if you could talk a little bit about, what got you specifically excited about the IP field and specifically early in your career, sort of what solidified the fact that, okay, intellectual property is the area of law that I want to focus on.
Yeah, really, really great question. And this is a true story. I was a music and French major from Wesleyan University, and I graduated knowing that I wanted to do work in the music industry in some way. And I moved to New York City and started, trying to find producers to work with, to write, to sing, to perform. And I started getting handed contracts.
Mm,
And this was before I even knew that such a person like who I am today existed. And so I remember like, okay, all the lawyers that when you think of lawyer, you think of like Law and Order, right? Like in a courtroom, like, arguing with people. I'm like, I didn't know about contract lawyers. But I'm very inquisitive and I felt like I was smart, right? Smart enough. And so as I'm getting these contracts, I start going to New York Public Library in Midtown and trying to check out books that can help me understand what this language is that I'm reading in front of me. Because the contracts were, written in relatively plain English, not too many, notwithstanding the foregoings and word to art thous, but I'm for the most part able to follow along. But I'm seeing language and I'm like, I want to make sure that I understand what I'm potentially signing away before I do so. And this is all again with the backdrop of, the MC Hammers and the TLCs and musicians who have signed bad deals in the back of my head. And as I start reading, it's like checking out books on music publishing and I'm reading them. I'm like, wow, like I'm actually like, oh, copyright. And I literally at this point started reading copyright law, like started reading the Copyright Act. Like you can find many copies of it on the internet. Started reading through it, started visiting copyright.gov. And slowly started to realize that I'm like, I have a weird, like, nerd out passion for this like area of law. At the same time, had a day job, was working in marketing. And I had this older colleague who kept asking me, like, okay, so when are you gonna go back to school? And I was like, oh my God, like I wrote a thesis in college. I like did a senior thesis concert. Like I've done all the work. Like I can't go back. I cannot do any more school. But I slowly started to warm to the idea of like, okay, what is going to be sort of the next, era of my life, right? Like after you spent your first 20 something years being a student, you take a break and you try to figure out like what is the next. And I kind of distilled down to, okay, I'll entertain the idea of maybe going to graduate school. Do I want to do my MBA or do I want to go get my JD? And I'm having that conversation with myself as I'm also recording, as I'm also getting these contracts, and it's starting to kind of like piece itself together. I'm like, oh, I think I could consider going to law school, but I would only go to law school if I'm going to be studying intellectual property in some way. Like that's the only thing that I'm not going to law school because I have a burning desire to be a lawyer. I'm going to law school because I want to better understand this area of law for myself. And to the extent that I can figure out how to make whatever that is part of like the next iteration of my career while I'm still working on my creative projects, then like maybe this is the right way of kind of marrying those two things together. And so I went into law school with that intention of like this is the path that I want to choose in terms of how I want to structure my own curriculum, in terms of the opportunities that I wanted to engage with from, an internship or a work standpoint, in terms of the research that I wanted to do. And from there, did all the steps, right? So took the LSAT, kind of sat back, saw what the scores were, applied to law school and went.
I love that. I love that you were so focused on a specialization from inception. Because if any law students are out there, not to bore the people that don't really care about the law, want to talk more about IP or specifically want to get into the creative aspect of it, but I think generally speaking, folks are encouraged to law students are encouraged to study it all, get a broad range of the law and see what you want to do, whether it's transactional litigation, whether it's corporate, whether you want to go into public interest. But similarly to you, I didn't know what I wanted to do as early my first year of law school, but I found that intellectual property was something that was intersecting with the technology companies that I wanted to work at. And I found a teacher that was teaching the law, but it was also teaching about culture and social impact and economics through IP law. So I thought, okay, this is probably the most fascinating area that will keep me sort of engaged personally but also keep me connected with creatives and engineers and people that are building stuff, right? People that are closest to the products and services, closest to the things that are going to touch people. So that's what really inspired me. And I inspire people out there that are listening that may be interested in going to law school. Definitely think about IP. It's going to consistently be relevant. But also beyond that, find the thing that just moves your spirit, right? I'm, so grateful that you mentioned that sort of things started spiraling together as you were creating and you needed to solve this problem for yourself. And so that's really great. Um, Moving forward, right? You mentioned earlier that you are part of the Save the Music Foundation. So you're a board member specifically. And the Save the Music Foundation, from what I understand, is a nonprofit that's focused on helping students and schools reach their full potential through the power of music. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be talking with you is because you're a musician and an artist yourself, right? So you understand how sound and melody affects the human spirit and the power of music. And at the same time, you mentioned you're a multi-hyphenate. At the same time, you're an attorney. So you understand that there's this multi-billion dollar copyright sector that is the music industry, right? So I'm curious, to what extent does copyright education and IP awareness come up in your capacity as a leader within the Save the Music Foundation in making sure students understand the power of copyrights, right? And enabling them to share their creations with the world.
That's such a really great question, and I'm so glad I have an opportunity to talk a little about the State of Music Foundation, which, as you mentioned, really focuses on ensuring that the pipeline of music education stays as intact as possible. And part of what our remit is to get resources, to get instruments into schools that, for a variety of different reasons, aren't able to sustain a music program for students. And this is, the young ones all the way through high school. And we really focus on making sure that the communities that we serve are receiving resources that are unique to them. So if that means you need mariachi instruments because that is what your students are interested in, or whether or not you're focused more on making sure we can get an educator in the classroom, or whether that means we're focusing on getting music technology into the classroom, right? Because we got a lot of future, Missy Elliott's and Timbalands and every Dr. Dre's out here, right? We have so many students who are interested in really wanting to learn the craft. And I'm so excited that they have the opportunity to do it at a younger age than I did, right? I didn't see my first recording studio until I was a senior in college. I remember walking in and being like, there's so many buttons here. Like I'm never going to get this. I just need to learn it enough to be able to do, work on my own pieces. And I would say I think that the concept for most of those students of copyright is maybe a little bit beyond what they can necessarily understand. They're really focused on learning the instruments, learning the notes. But I think as we're, as the students, particularly on the older end, the middle school or high school students, as they are getting closer to potentially going to college or to potentially honing in more on their craft, that's when I think they start to figure it out. Sort of the importance of what these frameworks are, even just by way of not necessarily their interactions with Save the Music, but just by being on the internet, right? Like everybody knows the most famous TikTok song that's being, that's underneath every video, and everyone knows, the language that you see at the end of the YouTube videos. I'm fair using this, and as a lawyer, I'm just like, oh God, okay, that's not a verb, but you can tell that there is this sort of fundamental understanding of I come in peace. Like I found something really cool and I want to be able to showcase it and I want to be able to use it as source material, but I don't, don't come sue me, bro. Like, right. I just wanted to like, experiment. I think that is really sort of where the students are going. What
Mhm.
I really hope for is that in that next level of education, because a lot of music programs at the collegiate level really tend to focus on either music business or music performance. And I have always wished that there was more programs that really put those two things together, because I always would endeavor for creatives, my friends, folks that I've helped, to kind of have the questions in mind of, am I protected? Do I, what have I shared with someone? Where, where's my comfort level in making sure that they feel secure in their engagement with their art with the world? But definitely on the performance side, you don't really focus on that. You focus on being able to nail a performance. And I'm very grateful for myself and others like me who have this gift of left brain, right brain, right? So I understand, yes, the creative process and what goes into it. And I can understand lawyers, well, why don't you sign a document? Because it's really weird when we're in the middle of having a jam and we're like iterating on this and this and this. You'd be like, well, hold up, let me give you this contract real quick to make
Right.
sure, like, that's just not natural. At the same time, on the left brain side, on the more business and legal affairs side, I do understand, okay, like you were in the creative process, but now you're coming to me because you're not sure if so and so is taking what you worked on and they're working on it with somebody else. Right now, you have all the concerns there. And I think we say the music focus is definitely on the performance aspect. We want to make sure that students at least are growing their love for music, that they have the opportunity to get the right resources to water that, so that way they can get to the point of, okay, I have manifested my talent. I know that that my music is great. I'm getting that validation. Now let me make sure that I'm protecting all the things that I'm doing, when I'm on that road to superstardom.
Absolutely. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about your role within the capacity of Save the Music and also speaking about if there is any hope in ensuring that IP awareness is raised. I think it is in the younger generation. The uh, necessity of being multi-hyphenate, as you explained, understanding the creative aspects, but also understanding the business and the legal aspects. I've been fortunate to be around some younger folks and some Gen Z folks, and even, Gen Alpha. I have siblings who have kids. And I would say that because they're engaging with these technical tools consistently, their IPIQ is higher than mine was when I was their age. Their understanding of they're creating things digitally, and that might be something that could be theirs, right? And so I think I've just generally, small sample size, but I've generally seen that I guess literacy around intellectual property for them, they understand that they're creating something of value. A quick aside also on how technology sort of requires that you have some sort of understanding of intellectual property. I was getting on YouTube earlier and I there was a pop-up that happened when I opened up the app. And that pop-up said that you can now choose if you want to allow third-party companies to use your content to train AI models in studio settings under, quote, third-party training. And this is a part of YouTube's commitment to, quote, responsible AI development. So I can imagine, and that just happened today, right? Maybe 30 minutes before we hopped on. So I can imagine, a teenager opening up the app and maybe not the majority of them, but a small percentage becoming curious. Oh, what does that mean? Training an AI model on my content. Wait, my content, do I own this? Well, what do I own? How do I own it? Right? I can see some, maybe it's a little bit too far-fetched, but I could see some teenagers and some young folks being curious just because they do engage with these tools consistently. And there are some notifications that might point them in a direction to understand that there is IP here. There is IP, and you can take steps to be able to put yourself in the best position to leverage that, right? If you understand the system and understand how the system can work for you and not just the organizations and the corporations where you spend the most of your time. So, a little aside on that front, a little personal anecdote. One more question before we get into technology. Family life and IP. So I did see on IG that you do post a lot about your family, particularly the woman in your life, um, your grandmother and your mom. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about their story, and are there any ways that intellectual property may have intersected with their life's work?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I admit that I'm still in a place in my life where I am tying together the strings a little bit better between the different parts of my multi-hyphenate life. And this is one that is a little bit newer for me to share. So I really do appreciate the question. I'll start with a nerdy IP point. A lot of folks don't take for granted now the idea of taking pictures and the fact that, if I take a picture and I get this filter on it, I get this angle, I know that I have, some sort of rights into it, right? Like, and there are few people read the Instagram and Facebook terms and conditions, but we know that like that's my photo. You can't use my photo because I took it. But photographs in particular were not always considered to be covered by copyright. And this will come up a little bit later in your technology question, because at the time that cameras were the new technology, this idea that and a derivative, a product that comes from a machine could have copyright protection was a foreign one, because up until that point, the art that we made, that we value, that had protection, were things that were made with like our actual hand. We put paint on a brush, we mold clay, right? We do all these things. And what is this machine doing here? And I feel like it's important to kind of start there with the question that you raised, because a lot of one of the things that I'm very blessed with and my family is that I come from a family of photographers. I come from a family of folks who are very intentional about documenting their lives, and I don't necessarily even think that they were doing so because they had some ulterior motive other than like, I'm just going to take a picture and I'll come back to it later, and I'll have a slideshow presentation for the family at Thanksgiving, and it'll tell them about all of our travels. And I'm very grateful that my grandparents had the foresight to not only take their photos and video reels, what we would consider today to be silent movies, and other mementos from their lives, their high school transcripts, their college transcripts. My mom's father was born in 1915 and graduated from CUNY on 135th Street. And my grandmother was born in 1922 and graduated from Queens College. I have photos of, and went to Jamaica College for like grade school. I have photos of like their grade school classes. I have my grandfather's high school transcripts and the notes that his teachers were writing. He was such a bright student, right? It's amazing to be able to have and to be able to experience the lives of our ancestors in the ways that they saw them, in the ways that they experienced them. And from that, I have found new ways of manifesting my own creative practice. And so that's taking the stories, taking the images, and putting them out into the world, but crafting stories around them. And so, as you mentioned, I have both a YouTube page and also on my Instagram, where I'm sort of storytelling across generations and across time. And so taking my musical talents. And so as one of my friends recently just found out, could sing. I'm like, turn the audio on. So taking my musical talents, and in some instances, singing old jazz standards. So I have one Summertime where I'm singing the story of summertime, and I'm showing you a narrative, a photo narrative of what summertime looked like for my grandparents and for my mom. And interspersing that with, parts of the history that aren't as happy, right? I had a cousin who was unfortunately shot by New York City police weeks before he was supposed to attend college. And so in my audio visual presentation of Summertime, you hear me singing, Summertime and the Living is Easy, and I'm showing you the Amsterdam newspaper article from that is discussing, his passing and what my family was trying to do to find answers. I find it really interesting and fun and intriguing to be able to share ordinary Black history in that way. But I think it also really helps me, again, to balance between that left brain and that right brain, right? It's like you see the creative material, you see the beautiful stories in the world, and how are we able to make sure that we feel comfortable sharing them with the world, and what mechanisms do we have in place for that? And so I look forward to sharing more. I have some other projects I'm working on in other parts of my creative practice. But yeah, I definitely enjoy balancing that left brain, right brain. I think for me, it's iron sharpens iron. I spend some time working on something creative, and then all of a sudden I feel the burning desire to like redline an agreement.
Absolutely. No, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's interesting. You have such a unique perspective because of the multiple aspects in your life that inspire you and drive you. Music, intellectual property, your family. And I think what I really took from what you just said is that intellectual property is sort of woven in throughout the fabric of humanity, right? And whether it be photography, whether it be writing, whether it be hieroglyphics, whether now, it's streaming, YouTube videos, right? You can sort of see and get a snapshot of where culture is through intellectual property, maybe particularly copyrights, probably the easiest one because we can see and hear those. And so it's so interesting to think about how to use, this system to be able to honor the legacy of a family member. And so I appreciate you sharing that, and I took a lot from it, and I think the audience will as well. So wrapping up here and thinking about where we're at right now, 2024 coming to an end, moving into 2025. We are in the latest chapter in the relationship between IP and new technologies. And as you know, new tech, especially in the hands of consumers, presents exciting opportunities on one hand, but also complex challenges for society as a whole on the other. And usually the IP system has to have something to say about how to protect and promote new forms of human expression that's shaped by those technologies. We've seen this over the last quarter century with copyright laws in music. The laws having to adapt when music distribution went from CDs to MP3s to streaming. And you recently wrote in one of your articles for the New York State Bar Association magazine that, quote, the conversation on artificial intelligence will likely lead us to the next meeting of the minds on copyright law, a la the next Berne Convention, as it also continues to push the progress of art and science, end quote. And for those who may not know the Berne Convention, just as an aside, the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works is an international treaty first adopted in Bern, Switzerland in 1886. And it set a foundation of minimum standards for the protection of copyright across the treaty's member countries. So as you look ahead, Nyasha, what do you believe is a necessary change or an adaptation to enhance the US IP system to continue to account for consistent changes in how human creativity and ingenuity is protected?
Such a great question. I think the answer to that question is definitely very heavily rooted in the legal and legislative process. Um, I think, as humans, we technology and our human innovation is able to move much faster than the laws. But
Mm.
that is a result of the laws being an intake process. I'm not going to craft a law just out of whole cloth, out of air. I want to craft something. I want to design a framework that is going to work for people. I want it to, to be as frictionless and as seamless as possible. And so in order for that to happen, what I first need is intake. I need to understand what is working, what is not working, what do we value, what are behaviors that we don't want to encourage, what are ones that we do want to encourage. And I think if you sort of use that as a foundation in a setting, it gives a little bit of context as to why we feel like law is so far behind when it comes to things, particularly like copyright law, copyright protection, right? Because again, we're dealing with a law that went into effect in 1976, but meaning they were having these conversations between 1909, our previous Copyright Act, and the early 70s before this one could come out. The amount that technology changed within the time that they were starting that conversation when they ended it, by the time they ended it, they were already behind.
Mm.
And we know this because we can see the patchwork that has been happening to our copyright laws, particularly under the Digital Millennial Copyright Act at the end of the 90s, particularly with respect to the different statutory changes that are made with respect to the fees that are given, in music licensing and in music streaming, et cetera. We see all of this being piecemeal, but it's because we don't know that the framework isn't working until enough someone's raise their hand and say the framework isn't working, or, we feel like we're being left out, or you have a strike where everyone says, I'm not working until you make this a system that works for me if you want me to work in it. And then within that, and I need to future proof this to make sure that you aren't going to now scan my body, pay me a day rate as a SAG member, scan my body, and use me as an extra by copying and pasting me green screen to the background of something. When we think about the trickle down effect of what that example looks like, now that person who's an actor can't be a living, working actor because they're not making enough to be able to sustain themselves. So now maybe they either give up on acting or they're working so many jobs in order to be able to keep their passion going. But it's not just the actor, it's the makeup artist, it's the grip person, it's the entire ecosystem of individuals that are also now not showing up on set because there's no people for them to put makeup on. There's no craft services or food for people to feed, right? Entire ecosystems that can fall apart all because of one change or something that we need to protect here, but we don't know it needs to be protected until this other thing happens. So all of that is a background and a context. We're definitely in a space where we have been looking at copyright law holistically, and we know what some of these holes are that have been poked at for years. The question now comes down to, both from a legal and a business standpoint, how are we going to continue to create ecosystems that allow for the progress of arts and useful sciences in a way where authors and inventors have the time, have the capacity, have the remuneration for their efforts? And I think with the increase, particularly in the uses of artificial intelligence and the ways that people are using artificial intelligence, is now causing us to ask questions that we hadn't really thought of before. Can an AI create a copyrightable piece of work? The answer to that question can be very simple as yes or no, but it causes us to have to dig in a little bit deeper because, the entire time I read this Copyright Act, I just assumed it was talking about humans, even though it never says copyright must be done by a human. But I can get through inferences that we must mean a person because there are multiple references to the author's domicile. Well, the only way you can have a domicile is to be a person who lives in a place, right? But we needed technology, we needed society to push us to this question, and we're just really just getting to the heart of that question right now. Is it okay? Do we have rights under fair use, under licensing regimes, under whatever, going back to your YouTube example, to be able to use someone else's work to intake to train an AI? Right? These are all things that we never had to think about 5 or 10 years ago, right? Like, we weren't thinking about this in the 90s. We weren't thinking about it in the 80s. We were on 8 tracks and record players, right? We weren't here yet, right? We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have to worry about how, people secretly taking pictures of you with their, with their glasses. We didn't have to think about any of these things. And all of these technologies cause us to bring these questions. But But within that, it's coming back to what are our values? What are the principles of this system that we want to build? What is it that we are trying to protect? And why do we think that it's worth protecting? And again, for me, it all comes back to the Constitution. It all under the realm of copyright law comes back to that copyright law. I want to encourage the authors and inventors to continue to keep pushing us forward. And this is the part of the framework from the perspective of the ideas in their head, how we can protect it, what it is that they want to do. And in order for us to do that, we need to keep asking ourselves, with respect to technology A, B, and C, do we feel like this framework still gets us there?
Mhm.
And we are at a place now where there are more players in the game, more perspectives, more individuals on both the creative and the business side who have a wide spectrum of opinions on these things, right? We have folks who are like artists who actively say, yeah, you can, I'll even put it on my website. You can use, is it Grimes? You can use my all my IP for this thing and I'll co-share it with you. All the way to the other end where you have companies who are saying, let me ask first, because their lawyers are like, make sure you have this in writing,
Right.
right? Make sure people think this is okay before you go out and start training all these models. It is going to take more time for us to complete this conversation, for sure. I think what is inherently needed in it are fair perspectives and a fair opportunity to share the stories, the risks, the concerns from all sides. And in an ideal world, for it not to necessarily just be led by a capitalistic end of the conversation, but one that balances the capitalism with the creativity, because one really cannot live without the other. And given the various other priorities of things that are going on in the world, unfortunately, what also happens is that that conversation slips on our priority list until it becomes full, bright, and center for us. And it is a responsibility of those within the ecosystem who understand its importance, who have that foresight to continue to keep pushing the conversation, to continue to keep bringing those bills back to Congress, to continue to keep being part of those advocacy groups that are keeping the conversation at the forefront, to ensure that we will continue to have a system that works the way that we need it to. Even though it's, she pushing like 40, 50, 50. She ain't old.
You hit it right on the head when speaking about the innovation ecosystem and needing to really identify what are the values, right, between all stakeholders, right? And I think that that's where the tension is. It's not only going to take, lawyers doing the work defensively and offensively for their clients in the IP space. It's also going to take policymakers. It's also going to take institutions, universities, right? Educating, but also maybe also being a little bit more creative on how they intake and distribute their intellectual property. I think it also is going to take technology companies, being a little bit more transparent, right, with respect to what they bury, as you mentioned earlier, in those terms of services and those privacy policies. Um, and I ultimately think, as you mentioned, that individuals, maybe say consumers, right? But definitely creatives are probably, yes, are probably going to be the group to push this to the forefront because there's going to be more individuals that are concerned about intellectual property. Maybe not to the same extent with respect to the economic backing, but the same extent with respect to the acknowledgement of ownership in the same way that corporations do. So I really appreciate that response. I really appreciate your time. I feel like we're just getting started, but hopefully we can have this conversation again. And I'm not going to ask you for a drop, some a tune at the end, but maybe after we end the conversation, I just want to hear maybe a few melodies. Just, maybe I could sample it, with you can register it first and get some royalties.
Yes, give me time to, get my paperwork in to the registrar.
It's only right. It's only right. Nyasha, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to continuing this conversation for all stakeholders, particularly creatives like you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.